Hello, I'm Dr. Nina Burrowes. I'm the founder of the Consent Collective, and I am sorry that my diary would not allow me to be with you online still, but at least live today. But I'm glad we've made a plan. So in this video, I want to share some of the core messages that I'd love to share with you. I'm feeling a bit sorry for myself that I don't get to then hear your questions and find out where you're at and how the work is going for you. But this is perhaps a good starting place for a conversation in the future. So as an organization, this is what the Consent Collective does. We do what it says on the tin. Our work is all centered on consent, sexual harassment, sexual harm, relationship abuse. As a psychologist, this has been the story of my career. It's the space that I've always worked in, starting off working with perpetrators, working for the prison service, and then subsequently working with victim survivors. And then, of course, with progress actually in this conversation, not just being a criminal justice conversation, but actually a conversation that society is more willing to have. As the Consent Collective, we work in all sorts of different spaces. But we like to center education settings. We think that as educators, you have such a beautiful opportunity to really have an impact when it comes to this work. So we started off in the higher education space. We've been working with universities for quite a few years now. And then a few years ago, we started with our first further education colleagues. And we're really delighted to be getting to know that space a lot better and to be tailoring our work towards your sector. So what I want to do today is to share how we're seeing the space and the work. We have quite an interesting lens on this work. We're obviously deep in it. This is what we do all the time, but we work in all these different spaces, and it does give us an opportunity to kind of really stand back and see what is happening. So I want to share some of that perspective with you. I have one key message in this video. It's really an invitation. It's an invitation for you to really think about your staff, the members of staff at your college or sixth form that you're asking to do this work. And when I say the work, I mean those individuals that you're asking to hold sessions on consent, to be the person that hold those conversations with their peers and also with students. So I'm going to talk a bit about them and how we see that space for them at the moment and why we think it's changing. Then I'm going to share some resources that we have to help you with all of this. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of share some of that longer vision that we have about where is this work going over the long term. So you may have noticed this yourselves, but this is certainly what we've noticed. And that's that the work is changing. And we see this as something to celebrate. We see this as a good thing because we as a sector, you as a sector, a lot of you have moved beyond the basics. And then when you move beyond the basic work and you really start to get into it, you get deeper into the terrain. Guess what happens? The terrain gets a bit more hilly. And so it gets more complicated. It might feel a bit more messy. But certainly the work is changing. We see that as, it's getting more sophisticated because you're getting into it. You're encountering the challenges that come with really doing the work. But for the individual who has to hold that, or the individuals at your colleges, that can mean that it can feel very different. Holding a consent workshop today can feel very different to holding a consent workshop maybe 5 years ago. So let me kind of share why that is. We're getting more sophisticated, and I think historically, if you were to say, well, what does a session on consent need to be? What's your theory of change? What's necessary here? People might have centered just simply information. We need to give students the right information about consent. So we can have a session here, have the slide deck. These are the laws. This is what consent means. This is what harassment means. This is our code of conduct here. So information, information, information. If you're providing a consent session that centers information, then the implicit theory behind that is that people are failing at consent because they don't have the right information. And information is important in all of this. Like, people do need to understand what harassment is, what the laws are. They do need that information, but it is far from being that simple. Information alone isn't going to be enough. I wish it was as easy as just telling people what the law was and then they would obey it. But of course, it's more complex than that. And so we need to get a bit more sophisticated, and a lot of spaces are, a lot of workshops are. So if we go beyond information, we've got understanding. And this is the moment where people begin to apply that information to themselves. Oh, this is about me. This is about my relationship with consent. This is an invitation to ask people, to get people to ask questions about their own behavior, reflect on their past. How good am I at asking for consent? What do I struggle with? That kind of understanding where you make it about you. And I think in a further education setting, this is probably a good space for colleges and sixth forms to be centering on in those sessions. And when we do that, when we provide an experience where people are deepening their understanding of consent and applying the learning to themselves, then our implicit theory is that people are failing at consent because they're not applying that information correctly. And if we want to get even more sophisticated, and I would invite you to get more sophisticated, we'd recognize that actually consent is a skill. It's not simply about information. It isn't simply an intellectual exercise either, where you apply that information to yourself. Consent is a supremely complex interpersonal skill. It is about so much more than just knowing what the rules are. It's a skill that is about listening and communication. It's about rejection. It's actually a really, really complex skill. And it's a skill that as a society, we're not especially good at. So it isn't a skill that we see role modeled especially well as we navigate our way around the world. We're much more likely to experience our own consent not being important to other people or organizations. We're much more likely to experience people or organizations trying to manipulate and persuade us, rather than to be genuinely interested in what our wants and desires are and how they can help us meet those. So if we were just providing information in a consent session, obviously you could get probably almost any member of staff on campus to deliver that session, because it would be quite straightforward. I have the information, you don't, and here it is. But when you get really into the work, you can see that this is really complex stuff. It's about personal development, and it's about personal development within the context of our society. So there's all sorts of issues there. Like, this is really rich and beautiful terrain, but it is not for the faint-hearted. It needs to be held by somebody who feels comfortable in these hills and feels comfortable navigating this level of complexity in a way that also feels safe for the students, peers that they're holding a session with. So when we look at consent as a skill, if we really get into the work, I want to make sure I've really kind of shared how we're seeing consent, so that we can be really clear about what we're talking about. So it's about this self-reflection skill. So how can we provide sessions where students develop skills around their ability to self-reflect on, well, what power do I hold in different situations? What mistakes might I have made when it comes to consent in the past? And I'm just going to kind of flag here, we talk about consent all of the time. And I think in sessions like this, it's really important to help students make that connection between consent for sex and just consent in life. But once we've made that connection around, like, we talk about consent for sex so much because if we get consent wrong in this area of our life, the amount of harm we can cause to other people can be really substantial. So, we're going to be talking about consent for sex a lot because we don't want to cause that amount of harm. But this skill called consent, is not just about sex. Like, it's something we're using on a daily basis. It's a skill that's about all of our interpersonal relationships. It's about our friendships. It's about our family. as you go into the workplace, it's going to be about being a manager, having customers. Like this consent skill is a really powerful and useful skill for life. So we can reflect on moments where we perhaps have made mistakes. We often talk about the pandemic when we're holding space on consent. I think it gives a really kind of useful shared lens on this moment where we were, told that it was safer to keep our distance from people and wear masks and take tests, and we were all navigating that with each other when we met up in person during the pandemic. And we can get curious about, actually, did I assume that everybody was comfortable not wearing a mask? I didn't actually check that it was all right that I took mine off. Like those kinds of mistakes is what I'm talking about. So it's about when we're helping people develop this skill, it's about helping them reflect on their sense of power, the mistakes they have made, their own boundaries, their own desires, their own yes, and what does that look like? It's about communicating all of this. It's about listening, and that's such an important skill. And again, this we tend to consume rather than listen in this society. That kind of deep listening where you're genuinely curious about the other person and you want to know what they are happy with, what their desires are, those kinds of things. It's also about having this ability to address sensitive topics, those conversations that feel like they're going to be a bit vulnerable, but they're really important to have anyway. And as well as all of that, it's about self-development. Actually, it's being good at being rejected is such an important part of this consent skill, like not taking it too personally, not pushing back against it, being sensitive to it and accepting it, and also not taking it as this huge slight on your character. It's just that it's not a good fit for them, and so it's not a good fit for you if it doesn't work for everybody involved. And it's about having the kind of emotional maturity and security to meet people and situations with curiosity rather than a need to control. This is big stuff, right? This is complex, important, beautiful, powerful psychology, sociology. There's lots in there. This is not the kind of thing you could just ask anybody on campus to hold. You need to be empowering stuff to get to this level. Do I think that you need to be ticking off all of these things with your students? Like, no, I think this is a lifelong journey right here, but it is the path that you would want your students to be on if you want to be having genuinely impactful consent sessions at your college or sixth form. And then we add to the mix the need to be trauma informed, to recognize that actually when it comes to your institution, yes, we should be having conversations about sexual harassment that is happening at your college and at your sixth form. But we also need to hold the fact that the far bigger number, the bigger population of individuals are those who already arrive at your college or sixth form with an existing history of sexual harm, of child abuse, growing up in a violent home, relationship abuse, and this is students and staff. So there's a need to be able to deliver these kinds of sessions to those students in a way that isn't going to be horribly triggering and traumatizing. And if you can provide those kinds of encounters for those students, I promise you're providing a really good session on consent, because actually being trauma informed is being consensual. If I'm working in a way that is trauma informed, I'm being incredibly sensitive to you and your needs and your consent. I'm giving you ways to opt out and giving you choice. And so this is one of those beautiful moments where the two things go hand in hand. But again, it's a big ask for staff to be able to hold this, know this, work in this way, to have that sensitivity and still do the work. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to share a resource that we have that is a training resource for those members of staff that you're asking to deliver workshops. It could be members of staff that you're asking to have quite a strategic role with the workshops. You're asking them to actually develop the content and sort out the program of delivery. And it's also for those who are perhaps given the content, but then asked to deliver them. So let me share my screen. Okay, so if you go to our website, which is consentcollective.com, and scroll down, these keep moving, so you have to find it. But you'll see here, we've got holding consent workshops in further education. So that is where you will be wanting to go. So this is the kind of landing page for this online course that is designed to guide your members of staff. Oh, that's me. Through a process so that they feel more empowered to hold these sessions. So if I just go into the course, here's one I made earlier. So the material that we've developed for your staff so that they just feel more confident includes getting them to think about your students. So we can talk to you about consent a lot, and we can talk to you about everything we're learning in all these different sectors, but you know your students and you will always know them better than we do. And so there's an invitation there to really think about your students, what material they would already have had already, so that they don't feel like they would know it all, because guess what, they told me about sex education and consent in school, so I know all of this. So thinking about how can you make the material be new and relevant, and also sensitive to those students who didn't get any sex education in the past. Thinking about different needs and abilities, different emotional maturity, different backgrounds of all of your different students. Also thinking about you. I think one of the really important things is that whoever delivers a session like this feels grounded and feels comfortable in the work. And you know what, if what you feel grounded and comfortable with is not going to necessarily be the same as your colleague, and so that invitation to reflect on your own comfort with the material and what would work for you, because that is in the interests of your students too. We want people to really think about impact. Like, this is such important work. We want it to evolve. So why do you think the material that you're presenting, the experience that you're providing, is going to have an impact with your students? So we've got a load of material there on consent. So, and also sharing our definition of consent and talking about those skills in more detail. Also inviting people to really think about theory of change and break down the material they're providing in terms of information. Is it just information? At what points are you touching on understanding? And then to what degree are you touching on skill development? And I think as a general rule, in the further education space, the space that you should be really thinking about is this understanding one. Moving from a situation where you might have provided students with a vignette, like, here's a story of two people, do you think this is consensual? Moving away from that is about other people, and moving towards an invitation to reflect on your own consent skills. During the pandemic, did you ask your friends if they were comfortable if you took your face mask off? Those kinds of gentle reflections on your own relationship with consent, so that people can get curious. And I think when you make it about them, then you can help people realize, oh, this is a lifelong journey. This isn't just knowing what the rules are. I need to start to think about myself in all of this. If we look to the left of the screen here, because I'm not going to go through the whole course, this will not be a very quick video if I do that. But we have a whole chapter on helping people plan sessions. And I think this is important, even if they don't hold that responsibility at your college or sixth form, because if you're going to feel comfortable in the session, you're going to have the opportunity to get curious about the rationale, curious about the theory of change. You need to know what the invitation is so that when you deliver the session, you can meet those expectations. We've got a whole section on just suggested materials that you could think about, questions. What could the content of that session be with your students? And then the main element of the course really is about how to hold space in a way that is trauma informed, how to hold space in a way that's going to be impactful, and how to hold space so that, you know, whatever comes up, you will feel equipped to hold. And being equipped to hold something does not mean you have all of the answers. It means that you've set up the space in a way where you recognize that you're not an expert and your job is not to provide all of the answers, but you can hold those questions and invite self-reflection, and also maintain that boundary in an appropriate way where when people bring in themes or topics or questions that actually aren't appropriate for the session. So we have a whole section on how to hold space. And then what we do is we provide a worked out session plan. So basically, if we were to come to your college to deliver a session ourselves, this is what it would look like. Here's the rationale, here's the theory of change. And we also go through and share, literally, this is the invitation, this is the words we would use to invite your students to come to the session, the materials, this is how we would go through the time that we've got, this is the follow-up material, all of that. Then we then talk about feedback and all of the rest of it. And there's a few add-ons, extra resources that we have, because we don't want to abandon your staff to this work. So if you're in a situation where you recognize, actually, you've got some really interesting but challenging themes coming up, like your students, for whatever reason, they really want to talk about misogyny in these sessions, we do offer ongoing supervision for your staff if you feel that that needs holding with them, so that they can continue to feel confident in the work. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Right, there we go. So there's one of the resources we're using to kind of help staff who are holding these sessions at colleges and sixth forms to feel more confident, so that, yeah, when a student wants to talk about Andrew Tate, they feel fully equipped to be able to hold that situation and not just knock it down, but to actually hold it in a way where that can be useful for all of the students involved, including the student with the question, and including the students in the room who don't want to go down there and have that railroad and take over what actually is a really important and useful session for them as they learn how to develop this skill that we call consent. Okay, I'm giving myself permission to point to the future, because this work is a journey. It's not just this, it progresses, and there's a lot of change happening at the moment, you may have noticed too. And I kind of want to point to the long-term future as a kind of a parting point. There's so much happening at the moment, and there's so many lenses that we could look at to the future with, especially when it comes to your students and education. We could have quite a pessimistic kind of lens on how complex and vulnerable the world is feeling, and what will your students need to be able to cope with the level of change and the volume of change that seems to be ahead, and how do you sit with uncertainty, and maybe more interestingly, like, what skills will be needed in the future, they're needed now, quite frankly, in order to sit with uncertainty, but also be creative and still be able to connect and create useful creative relationships with others. Another lens is maybe the kind of AI lens, and like, actually, what's the employment market gonna look like in the future, and genuinely, what skills do your students need to develop so that they can be in that market successfully? What is it that AI can't do? What is it that employers will be looking for from their human resource? You know what, and that's enough. And I think the other bit is just, this is just progress. This is just, well, progress is maybe the wrong word, but this is just the movement of the work. This is just where we're going. And one of the things, a kind of hopeful lens that I'd like to put on all of this, is that education itself is shifting. And I feel like in the past, and maybe now in a lot of contexts, this consent work is seen as a sideshow, like it's done by maybe support services, or it's not seen as the core business of the educating people workplace, like it's not like the core purpose of this college is closely aligned to that consent workshop. But actually, I look forward to a future where it really is, because what I'm talking about is emotional intelligence. I'm talking about how can you use your responsibility as an educator, as an institution that is preparing people for their future. are we moving towards a time where we're going to center personal development and EQ over this, the kind of types of intelligences that have been centered in the past? It doesn't matter where you're doing your reading at the moment or what you're listening to. Everywhere there's this big picture of change coming, and we need to be able to cope with that change. And so I really look forward to the future where the personal development of your students, the development of advanced interpersonal skills, the development of their emotional intelligence is a really core part of what you're doing. And that, of course, these consent workshops have been doing that work for ages, but of course, you would need to center them a lot more and give them more time, more resource as things progress. So that's what I hope I'm doing in 10 years' time. I hope that the work that organizations like ours do is much more central to what you're doing as an institution. And I think that would be a pretty exciting future. And you know what, in terms of the well-being of your students, I really think we all need these skills to help us not just cope with life, but be able to meet challenges of the very best of ourselves. That's ultimately what this is about. When consent goes wrong, when people harm others, it is so often a story of somebody who is not equipped to hold their own personal pain, and they're taking it out on someone else. It is like pain paid forward. And so helping people with this stuff is not just essential in terms of reducing sexual harassment at your college or your sixth form. This is the kinds of skills for life that we need everybody to have, not just so that they don't harm others, but for themselves, for all of us, for the challenges that it looks like we might be facing as we go, as time goes forward. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that it's been useful. I hope you've been able to place the work that's happening at your college or sixth form, within the context of what I've been talking about. I hope it's raised a few questions. If you want to get in contact, you can't read my details. Hang on a second. There we go. So you can check us out at consentcollective.com. You can find us on all the usual social media spaces. But yeah, I look forward to being able to connect with you. If you look on our website or get in contact with us, we have a fairly established peer network for people doing what you're doing in the higher education space. And we're going to be starting one in the further education space. So do send us an email, hello@consentcollective.com if you'd like to know more about that. Thank you. Hopefully see you live next time.